I think we have time for one more caller before the break. I appreciate the call, Florida and Robert. You're who do we have, Devin?
Next, we got Steve in the Gold Coast.
Oh, right on. Well, Steve, we might have to hold through the break. We'll see. But go ahead, Steve.
Well, I think you touched on some really important topics. And on this last one with regard to this wacko doctor in Texas, unfortunately, the boards don't generally reference these sorts of questions, so it's not as if she was going to be ferreted out.
Right. How do you feel about demon semen?
Right.
Is that a multiple choice question or just a box I check? Yeah.
Exactly. And on that note, I would highly recommend, Frontline had a great piece this past week about the influence of nuts like Alex Jones on our political process and the way in which it really has turned elections. So for anyone who hasn't seen it, you've got to tune in because it'll let you know exactly where America is in terms of Frontline. Exactly the role that Alex Jones and his ilk played in the election of Donald Trump. I mean, the crazy people that we sort of, marginalized, didn't care about and said, oh, well, the nuts have always been there. They turned out in large numbers in 2016 to vote for the candidate that Alex Jones loved. And guess what? That turned the election in many states. And we cannot just simply dismiss these people. And unfortunately, all too many of us, who were part of the so-called elitist crowd, think, you know what, this is below me. I'm not going to get into this quagmire. I'm not going to debate these crazies because you can't win. It's like debating the flat earth nuts. Yeah, but if you don't get into that, then they're just left to their own devices, and there's nobody left to challenge them.
Oh, that's why I bring it up on here. That's why I'm one of the few people like on Twitter that I'll poke the QAnon bear every so often of these nutcases because they need to watch their argument fizzle. Because the problem with Alex Jones's arguments is the problems with Rand Paul and Ron Paul's arguments a lot of times is that they use an establishment premise, which is, hey, we all hate it when something happens. That we all hate traffic, that kind of concept. Baseline everybody agrees on. And then their first solution of it is one that we can probably share. And the second and third one get increasingly crazy and suggest something awful and nefarious. That's how that works. It's the system by which it's how clickbait works. It's how, and so Alex Jones, by the way, is a fraud. I've been on his show. I was on it with my buddy Richard Hunter. Alex Jones is a fraud. For anybody who listens to him and watched him over the years or thought, well, he's occasionally got a point, that's how he does it. That's how they get you with the occasional point. Occasionally, the guy on the L train lets you win at 3-card Monte. It doesn't mean you were smart.
Right.
He let you win.
I mean, that's the basic formula behind the conspiracy theory. It's one part truth, 2 parts exaggeration, 3 parts lie. But you have to have the 1 part truth. And this is why, Alex Jones, as you rightly pointed out, people who follow him, they seem to forget that, he's been forced to apologize publicly for the Pizzagate nonsense. He's been found to be culpable with
he lost the lawsuit.
Sandy Hook. Yeah, exactly. I mean, his ex-wife says, he considers his audience a bunch of nutbags. But nonetheless, he knows that this is where his bread is buttered. He makes by some estimates $100,000 a year, a week, rather, from a week to a day.
Oh, yeah.
At the height of
the nuttier you get on these outlets, the more money you make, and it's not all from the suckers. I know we have to take a break. Can you hang on for a second because this is a worthwhile conversation because I want to talk about how the disinfo information campaigns that come into our elections do play into this. So hold on for a second. We got to take a break. It's the Hal Sparks Radio program, Mega Worldwide on WCPT Radio, Chicago's Progressive Talk. More with Steve from the Gold Coast and his hamburger phone right after this. So Steve from the Gold Coast is still on the phone with us, and I was just making the case, and for all of our viewers on Facebook, you might want to sidle up close to your screen, that Alex Jones is a complete fraud and a huckster, and he has a system by which he sells BS, and a lot of times his show kind of dovetailed off almost like the George Norrie coast-to-coast stuff. Originally it was like alien landings and they're hiding Roswell and all that kind of stuff, and then it eventually rolls out and turns into well, it's Agenda 21 and the UN's really just are shock troops. The problem is there's a horseshoe theory to it that always bends back around to, well, there is no Antarctica. It's just a ring of ice around the Earth, and it's flat, and black helicopters keep us from escaping to the really good land, like Snowpiercer or something. So the frontline piece that you were mentioning, Steve, is he with us? Are you with us, Steve? Still there?
Yes, I'm right here.
Oh, there you go. Good, cool.
Yeah, I'm here.
I have noticed, by the way, and this is my ventures into the social media world as far as broadcasting. I've always done, most of my broadcasting legit, and I started on Ustream back in the day as a way of just kind of hanging out with fans when I was doing Queer as Folk. When we were shooting, I couldn't really interact with people. The shoot days were awful. And so I was like, I'll have little get-togethers and just kind of talk about stuff I want to talk about while I'm isolated up here in Canada on the internet, and gathered a crowd there, and everybody hung out. But I mainly talked about just music I liked and stuff that was going on. And then as I watched who grew on the internet as far as, grabbing space, the Alex Joneses and the Joe Rogans of the world, and even on the, on the left, the TYTs and the Jimmy Dores of the world, you start looking at, and this is with all respect to the folks that have lately been showing up in my chat who are giving super chats from outside the country, which are rare, few and far between, and pretty consistent viewers from those places who decide, oh, hey, I want to give something to the show. And you recognize after a while that not everybody who's supporting Alex Jones financially is American, for sure.
Oh, no way.
And a good portion of them mean this country ill. Hmm? And they know that the message that he spreads will effectively undermine people's feelings about democracy, about their value as voters, the strength and worth of democracy in the first place, and as do some of the more kind of fascistically leaning across the entire spectrum, that they get boosts
and how
if they say the right thing.
That's a really important point, and that's a really important point, because people need to understand exactly what the end game here is. I mean, now just think about it for a second. If you pay attention to what's been going on in terms of following the media, reading newspapers, online, watching the news, and so forth, when was the last time since the outbreak of COVID in mid-March here, where it became this major story, that you saw any coverage of anything that's going on in the international community outside of the COVID issue? We still have wars, we still have famines, we still have conflict, yet all of a sudden these issues have gone away. And that's exactly what the end game is. If you can create and generate internal strife in the United States, you can therefore detract our attention away from other issues, human rights violations, inequalities, and so all sorts of things that that the institutions like the UN and others are hoping to address. Because now we're just consumed by what's going on in America, and that's exactly what this is meant to do. And that's why the Russians and the Chinese have this agenda. Yeah,
well, and the Saudis as well. There is also there's been a strategy for a good long while as well that, like movie financing for a long time, has shifted over the last 15 to 20 years to moving away from Cannes, which was mostly European democracies and the rich people from those funding films, to Chinese money, which they can make up as they do, and it only gets to leave the country if the government lets it. So there's no Chinese funding for a movie that the Chinese government doesn't want made. And so it's incredibly subtle but ongoing. When's the last time you saw a movie where a police officer, that wasn't an indie, where a police officer, a U.S. spy, or an FBI agent or somebody was a genuine hero, where they did something good for their community, sacrificed their life? Even the movies that, where World War II is basically the sticking point, where they can't seem to not get funded by Europeans. Europeans will pay for World War II success movies because they're always pushing back against the rise of Nazism and right-wing extremists on the European continent. So they like to continuously dunk on Nazis by making World War II movies, and it has value. It not only is reminder of history, but it also tells your society, you know, we all got together with a shared belief in democracy and put aside our differences.
And as we all know, right, and as we all know, you know, I mean, the Nazi thing is an easy shot. I mean, who in heaven's name is going to defend the Nazis? So it's an easy, narrative, to adopt. You know, and
well, there are good people on both sides.
There's a whole lot here.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. But you raised a really important point in terms of this whole evolution, in terms of the coast to coast George Norrie thing. You know, that was largely apolitical, whereas people like Alex Jones managed to turn it into a very political, or shall we say, oriented outcome. Whereas, we're going to blame government, and government includes Democrats and, by the way, the establishment Republicans. Now, let me think of a candidate who is anti-democratic and anti-Republican establishment. Donald Trump. So he fits perfectly into that narrative for Alex Jones, and so gave Alex Jones credibility.
Against Vladimir Putin, and the Chinese government and the North Korean government and the Saudi royal family are against democracy.
Right.
They don't want to see it rise in their own country. So the more they can make it look bad and more trouble than it's worth, which is really the baseline argument most of the time. It's more trouble than it's worth. You don't give freedom to people because what they do with it.
Right. Right, and say what you will about people like George Bush or whatnot, the establishment Republicans. Not a single establishment Republican would have ever been seen on the Alex Jones show. I mean, ever, but obviously Donald Trump is not with that, and that's exactly the point. And the reason that this works is, unlike anything else, if you're going to have a discussion about theoretical physics or about virology, by and large, you're going to bring people in who have credentials in those fields. But the thing about democracy, it's an ugly little truth, is that everybody gets the same vote. A professor of political science from the University of Chicago doesn't get any more consideration than Joe the plumber, who happens to be an ardent fan of Donald Trump. And that's exactly.
Yeah. So I appreciate you bringing this up, and that's why I wanted to extend it into the next spot. And I'll check out that special. But absolutely. Thanks so much for the call. Most people, I don't know, some people are new to the show and whatnot or whatever, is that ages ago, because my buddy Richard is from Texas, we were down there, I was doing a show, and he's like, hey, we could be on Alex's show if you want to. And I was like, that's hilarious. He's crazy. And we went on his show, and he had just come back from, and I've told this a couple of times, but he had just come back from the air. He'd just seen the documentary on Hillary that eventually became the Citizens United case. And he was going off on it on the air. And famously, I can't remember who did what, but Richard got him to admit that Obama wasn't evil, and I got him to admit that the ACA had some good points. It was a weird, tiny wins that, you just couldn't fight back against. But in the process of it, that was on the air. During the breaks, all he talked about was the chocolate cake they were serving at the Hillary doc. That they had this reception at the Hillary documentary, and the chocolate cake was so good, and he and his wife had far too many pieces of it. He had like 4 pieces. So I just pictured Alex Jones sitting at a table at this post-Hillary thing, eating 4 pieces of chocolate cake, believing that Hillary Clinton is tied in with some sort of, Illuminati group of lizard people, and that this is a documentary that's going to take her down, but he's just going to eat the food that was delivered there. You could not believe a word of what you say about any of these folks if you would actually eat food in public provided to you by an unknown source. How do you... the fact that he's alive was always dude, if they wanted to get rid of you, they can get rid of you. They don't care. What you're saying is nuts. And the same thing is, maybe that they'd martyr me, but only if they shot you, not if you died of a heart attack because you had a bad piece of chocolate cake. After your 4th piece of chocolate cake, if he keeled over, you think anybody would have gone, they murdered him? They'd go, nah, I think that was natural causes. Did you see him? I think he choked on the last piece. You have to chew, Alex. You have to chew. And he still had
just the enjoyment of the cake really has to dissipate like halfway through the 2nd piece.
Yeah, if not shame, just the work of chewing.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not even your
I can power through shame when I'm shoving chocolate in my face.
Right.
But
after a while, anything becomes a job.
Yeah.
So that was only during the breaks. He never brought it up during the show, and I was like, well, that tells me who you are. And the money that supported his show is money that George Norrie and Coast to Coast, even though it entertains far more people, would never see. And it was the making it political that actually brought that seed money from all over the world. If we can raise this guy's voice up, we can create a situation where the American people hate and distrust their own government to the point where they take their hands off the reins, and we can put somebody in who would do some awful stuff. So again, this is why when they roll through on the internet and call me all kinds of political slurs and whatnot, and try to paint me into this box of being somehow radical, when I respect our country and our democracy and our Constitution and its equitable application to every American, that every citizen has the right to vote and should be allowed to vote, and no non-citizen should be allowed to vote, period, end of story, no question, don't worry about that, don't want it, not interested. If I lose politically because I lose, I'm willing to go with that as long as it's on a fair playing field. I want our institutions to be functioning. I don't want the answer to be riots and protests. Riots and protests. Revolution is the 6-minute abs of democracy. It's getting your stomach stapled instead of going on a diet. Sometimes it might be a medical emergency. Most of the time, when people are flipping through it on the internet or looking up ads for it, they really know that they could handle it themselves. They do have the capability, but it's going to take time and effort. Consistent, constant gardening. We got to take a break. We'll be back right after this.